Hello, World Civilization class. Welcome to week 6. Today, for this announcement, I'm mainly going to talk a little bit about the content. What I just want to remind you, again, when it comes to the work done, if you have any issues with your grades or problems, please continue to contact me. I'm only working one job now, which means this one, at least at this point of the summer. So I should be extra available to talk to anyone on issues that you may have. Oops, sorry about this runaway camera. So make sure you keep communicating and talking with me when you need help. Now, there's really two of my most controversial weeks that I teach. When I say controversial, meaning where I have some students feeling a little bit frustrated or concerned on the content. It's the evolution one, which we talked through that one, and then this one. And this is only for those of you who that are more or less strict evangelical, or what some people would say fundamentalist. That basically you're of a Christian tradition or ultra Orthodox Jewish, and the Bible is literal history. That is divine history, and it's not something that you question in terms of the way that it's told in the Bible. I understand this very much with my own background and what I've grown up in, and as I tell you all, I don't even tell you what I really think about everything. Needless to say, I know that this can be a very sensitive topic for those of you who are, have strong faith and are involved in this tradition. So what I just want to do is I want to remind you again, like I did with the evolution class, is that you're not required to believe anything. Your participation in this doesn't mean that you've compromised your view on this. I talk about understanding what secular historians have said about the history of ancient Israel. And secular basically means, the non-religious world, and why they break things down the way they do. Now, what I'd like to clarify, though, is that it's, and I think I mentioned some of this already in one of my lectures, that this is not an agenda, and it's not an anti-Bible agenda. Believe it or not, that many of these conclusions are drawn by theologians, and this history is taught in many seminaries for those who are wanting to be of maybe the conservative or reform branch of Judaism, or other branches of Christianity. And so there's a lot of Jewish and Christian scholars that see the Bible, that the stories are divine truths, but they're not necessarily believing that they're divine history. That the history doesn't have to be literal in order for the message to be bigger than that, right? And so I'm not actually advocating that that's the way you look at it either. What I'm just trying to tell you is that I want you to be aware that this isn't an attack on your faith. It's a different way that people look at a history. Because here's the issue, right? The Bible does tell history, and all historians try to analyze archaeological data with history books, especially ancient ones, and see where they look the most convincing or not. And that's how it works with everything. It only becomes sensitive when that's being done to something that comes out of your faith tradition, right? And then that's a little bit more, it's going to be more sensitive. But for instance, most historians don't believe the founder of Lao Tzu, of Taoism, Lao Tzu, actually existed. But for Taoists, for many that are just going to go by, believe he did. So again, this isn't just, I'm just trying to say that this is how history works everywhere, and this is also the kind of tension between faith-based communities, traditionalist understandings of things, and, what the evidence is. So one of the other things I needed to point out is I mentioned that there's a church tradition that St. Mark brought Christianity into Egypt. Secular historians don't necessarily even know if St. Mark existed, but that is a church tradition. And so I'm just trying to get you to always understand the differences between these things. And we as individuals will always kind of take more or less. I mean, when you're having a look at evidence and you have consensus views versus kind of fringe views or minority views, ultimately you're going to pick one of those. I teach to be responsibly. It's better to always teach the consensus view as much as possible. And then once in a while, draw your attention to minority or fringe perspectives. So like with Akhenaten in Egypt, I talked about that there has been a debate about whether or not he influenced ancient Israel. And actually, a lot of the archaeologists don't really see that connection anymore. But that was especially viewed to be the case, several decades ago. But I'm not always on top of that particular field. And so what I want you to also understand is that new evidence comes out every day. So anytime you find interest in a particular historic subject matter and you look at a field and that there's a debate about what actually happened, I just want you to remember that that is just constantly moving, because more and more evidence can often come and bring a different perspective on things. I hope that makes sense. I guess what we do is we just realize that it's kind of like a court case that with history. Sometimes, we think somebody's innocent or guilty for maybe half a century, and then somebody finds an archive or a diary and a confession, and it completely rips open our understanding. So that's how history works. And so the last thing that I wanted to point out is I've tried to make a big to-do about, it's in the discussion, and I mentioned it in a part of the lectures, not to impose your idea of the Israel-Palestine conflict that exists now on this history. And I do cover this thoroughly in my World Civ 107 class. I kind of talk about it a little bit in one of the lectures. If that interests you, if that's something, if you don't think you're ever going to have my 107 class and you just kind of want to understand more about a conflict that starts in the 19th century, which is the modern Israel-Palestine conflict, and what its relationship is or is not to this ancient history. So again, just to reiterate certain things, we don't really get a political movement of Jews who are mainly non-religious, who saw the Bible as a historical blueprint for a nationalist idea, for Jews to return to Palestine, which at that point in the 19th century, the majority of the population were Palestinian Arabs, some Christian, some most Muslims. Then there are some Druze, which is a minority group within Islam, and a very small minority of Jewish population. That's always been there. And what ends up happening is that later on, we start to see religious Jews and non-religious Jews gaining momentum on this idea, which is called Zionism, to return to the land, which you can imagine that the local population, when you ever have another population come and tell another population that they're the original owners of the land and that they're not really the ones that belong there, we can understand how that causes a conflict and tension. And ultimately, a lot of terrible things happened on that circumstance, and we get the creation of Israel in 1948. So this is modern history. And what's happened is, even though ancient history sometimes gets brought up in the conversation, if we erased all of this history that we're talking about in ancient Israel, it would only slightly alter some of the problems that are around what we see with the current conflict. And so, in any case, I think it's important to that, because for a lot of biblical, for Christians, especially evangelicals, they are always, I've noticed this trend to impose the way that you understand the Bible onto what's going on currently, and it distorts the lens in which I think you should be looking at that if you actually care about how people in that region should be treating each other, and like what would be a better, more peaceful solution, as opposed to just supporting one side of the conflict so enthusiastically without actually like seeing the other side. And there are two sides of the story, which I do cover in my World Civ 107 class. Again, or if you call and talk to me on the phone, I'll try to give you a nuanced approach as much as possible, despite my own feelings about the overall conflict. So, having said that, looking now back at this one, I hope all of you find this very interesting. It's a very important history to understand, and I throw in some things that you might not have been exposed to as much, like the Samaritans, and you should find that very interesting as well, and the issue of Asherah and Yahweh. So, without further ado, I'm going to end it here, and if you have any questions or problems, make sure you contact me, and I hope you have a great week.